Lie back, put your headphones in, snuggle in tight. Are you all ready? Then let me read you a bedtime story, my dears. Let's begin. The Kiss. The quiet of the deserted building encircled the little glowing room as the velvet encircles the jewel in its case. Occasionally faint sounds came from the distance, the movement of cleaners at work, a raised voice, the slamming of a door. The man sat at his desk as he sat through the busy day, but he had turned sideways in his seat, the better to regard the other occupant of the room. She was not beautiful, had no need to be. Her call to him had been the saner call of mind to mind, that he desired beside the passing benediction of her hands, the fragrance of her corn gold hair, the sight of her slenderness. This she had guessed and gloried in. Till now he had touched her physical self neither in word nor deed. Tonight, she knew, the barriers would be down. Tonight they would kiss. Her quiet eyes, held by his during the spell that had bound them speechless, did not flinch at the breaking of it. The Lord made the world, and then he made this rotten old office, the man said quietly. Into it, he put you and me. What, before that day, had gone to the making and marring of me, and the making and perfecting of you, is not to the point. It is enough that we have realized, heart and soul and body, that you are mine and I am yours. Yes, she said. He fell silent again, his eyes on hers hungrily. She felt them and longed for his touch, but there came only his voice. I want you. The first moment I saw you, I wanted you. I thought then that, whatever the cost, I would have you. That was in the early days of our talks here, before you made it so courageously clear to me that it would never be possible for you to ignore my marriage and come to me. That is still so, isn't it? She moved slightly, like a dreamer in pain, as again she faced the creed she had hated through many a sleepless night. It is so, she agreed, and because it is so, you are going away tomorrow. Yes. They looked at each other across the foot or two of intervening space. It was a look to bridge death with, but even beneath their suffering, her eyes voiced the tremulous waiting on her lips. At last he found the words. You are the most wonderful woman in the world, the pluckiest, the most completely understanding. You have all the widest charity. I suppose I ought to thank you for it all. I can't. That's not my way. I have always demanded of you, demanded enormously, and received my measure pressed down and running over. Now I'm going to ask this last thing of you. Will you, of your goodness, go away, upstairs, anywhere, and come back in 10 minutes' time? By then I shall have cleared out. She looked at him almost incredulously, lips parted. Suddenly she seemed a child. She stammered, then rising to her feet with a superb simplicity. But you must kiss me before you go. You must. You simply must. For the space of flaming moment, it seemed that in one stride he would have crossed to her side, caught and held her. For God's sake, he muttered, in almost ludicrous fear of himself. Then, with a big effort, he regained his self-control. Listen, he said hoarsely, I want to kiss you so much that I daren't even get to my feet. Do you understand what that means? Think of it just for a moment, and then realize that I am not going to kiss you. and I have kissed many women in my time, too, and shall kiss more, no doubt. But it's not because of that I'm holding back. No, neither is it because I funk the torture of kissing you once and letting you go. It's because I'm afraid for you. For me? Listen, you have unfolded your beliefs to me, and, though I don't hold them, don't attempt to live up to your lights. The realization of them has given me a reverence for you that you don't dream of. I have put you in a shrine and knelt to you. Every time you have sat in that chair and talked with me, I have worshipped you. I would not alter all that, the girl said faintly, if you kissed me. I don't believe that. Neither do you. No, you don't. In your heart of hearts, you admit that a woman like you is not kissed for the first time and last time by a man like me. Suppose I kissed you now. I should awaken something in you as yet half asleep. You're young and pulsing with life, and there are, thank heavens, few layers of that damnable young girl shyness over you. The world would call you primitive, I suppose, but I don't. Oh, Lord, you must see it's all or nothing. You surely understand that after all I had left you, you would not go against your morality, perhaps, but you would adjust it, in spite of yourself, to meet your desire. I cannot safely kiss you. But you're going away for good. For good? Child, do you think my going will be for your safeguard? If you wanted me so much that you came to think it was right and good to want me, wouldn't you find me, send for me, call for me, and I should come? God, I can see the look in your eye now, when the want had been satisfied, and you could not drug your creed any more. Her breath came in a long sigh. Then she tried to speak, tried again. It is so, isn't it? He asked. She nodded. Speech was too difficult. With the movement, a strand of the corn-gold hair came tumbling down the side of her face. Then that being the case, said the man, with infinite gentleness, his eyes on the little tumbling lock, I shall not attempt so much as to touch your hand before you leave the room. At the door she turned. Tell me once again, she said, you want to kiss me? He gripped the arms of his chair. From where she stood she could see the veins standing out on his hands. I want to kiss you, he said fiercely. I want to kiss you if there were any way of cutting off tomorrow, all the tomorrows, with the danger they hold for us. I would kiss you. I would kiss you and kiss you and kiss you. Where her feet took her during the thousand years that he was going, she could never afterward say. But she found herself at last at the top of the great building, at an open window, leaning out, with the rain beating into her eyes. Far below the lights wavered, and later she remembered that echoes of a far-off tumult had reached her as she sat, but her ears held only the memory of a man's footsteps, the eager tread that had never lingered so much as a second's space on its way to her, that had often stumbled slightly on the threshold of her presence, that she had heard and welcomed in her dreams, that would never come again. The raindrops lay like tears upon her face. She brushed them aside and, rising, put up her hand to feel the wet lying heavy on her hair. The coldness of her limbs surprised her faintly. Downstairs she went again, the echoes mocking every step. She closed the door of the room behind her and idly cleared a scrap of paper from a chair. Mechanically her hands went to the litter on his desk, and she had straightened it all before she realized that there was no longer any need. Tomorrow would bring a voice she did not know, would usher a stranger into her room. would usher a stranger into her room and take her measure from behind a barrier of formality. For the rest, there would be work and food and sleep. These things would make life that had been love. She put on her hat and coat. The room seemed smaller somehow and shabbier. The shaded lights had invited, now merely irritated. The whimsical disorder of books and papers spoke only of an uncompleted task. Gone was the glamour, and the promise, and the good comradeship. He had taken them all. She faced tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, empty-handed, in her heart the memory of words that had seared and healed in a breath, and the dead dream of a kiss. Her throat ached with the pain of it. Then suddenly she heard him coming back. She stiffened for one instant, mind and body. She was rigid with the sheer wonder of it. Then, as the atmosphere of the room surged back, tense with vitality, her mind leapt forward in welcome. He was coming back, coming back! The words hammered themselves out to the rhythm of the eager tread that never lingered so much as a second space on its way to her, that stumbled lightly on the threshold of her presence. By some queer, reflex twist of memory, her hands brushed imaginary raindrops from her face and strayed uncertainly to where the wet had lain on her head. The door opened and closed behind him. "I've come back. I've come back to kiss you. Dear, dear!" Her outflung hand checked him in his stride towards her. Words came stammering to her lips. "Why? But this isn't... I don't understand. All you said, it was true, surely. It was cruel of you to make me know that it was true and then come back." "Let me kiss you. Let me. He was overwhelming her, ignoring her resistance. "I must kiss you. I must kiss you," he said again and again. No, you shan't. You can't play with me. You said you were afraid for me, and you made me afraid too, of weakness, of danger, of my longing for you. "Let me kiss you. Yes, you shall let me. You shall let me." His arms held her. His face touched her. "Aren't you afraid any more? Has a miracle happened? May we kiss in spite of tomorrow?" Inch by inch she was relaxing. All thought was slipping away into the great white light that held no tomorrow, nor any fear of them, nor herself, nor of anything. The light crept into her face, rose to her heart, her head. Through the radiance came his words. "Yes, a miracle. Oh, my dear, my little child. I've come back to kiss you, little child." "Kiss me then," she said, against his lips. Hazily she was aware that he had released her, that she had raised her head, that against the rough tweed of his shoulder there lay a long, corn-gold hair. She laughed shakily, and her hand went up to remove it. But he caught her fingers and held them to his face, and with the movement and the look there came over her in a wave the shame of her surrender, a shame that was yet a glory, a diadem of pride. She turned blindly away. "Please," she heard herself saying, "let me go now. I want to be alone. I want to. Please don't tell me tonight. Tomorrow." She was at the door, groping for the handle. Behind her, she heard his voice. It was very tender. "I shall always kneel to you in your shrine." Then she was outside, and the chilly passages were cooling her burning face. She had left him in the room behind her, and she knew he would wait there long enough to allow her to leave the building. Almost immediately, it seemed, she was downstairs in the hall, had reached the entrance. She confronted a group of white-faced, silent men. "Why, is anything the matter? What happened? Odell?" The porter stood forward. He cleared his throat twice, But for all that, his words were barely audible. "Yes, Miss Carell. Good night, miss. You best be going on, miss, if you'll excuse—" Behind Odell stood a policeman. Behind him again a grave-eyed man stooped to an unusual task. It arrested her attention like the flag of red danger. "Why is the door to your room being locked, Odell?" She knew her curiosity was indecent, but some powerful premonition was stirring in her, and she could not pass on. "Has there been an accident? Who is in there?" Then, almost under her feet, she saw a dark pool lying sluggish against the tiles. Near the door another, on the pavement outside another, and yet another. She gasped, drew back, felt horribly sick, and as she turned, she caught Odell muttering aside to the policeman, "Young lady's his secretary. Must be the last that seen him alive. All told, 'tain't more'n half an hour since he left." "Good night, Odell," says he. "Miss Carell's still working. Don't lock her in," says. He would have his joke. Must have gone round the corner and slapped under the car. Wish to God the ambulance. Her cry cut into his words as she flung herself forward. Her fingers wrenched at the key of the locked door and turned it. In spite of the detained hands that seemed light as leaves upon her shoulder and as easily shaken off, unhearing, unheeding, she forced her way into the glare of the electric light flooding the little room, beating down on to the table and its sheeted burden. Before she reached it, knowledge had dropped upon her like a mantle. Her face was gray, as the one from which she drew the merciful coverings, but her eyes went fearless to that which she sought. Against the rough tweed of the shoulder lay a long, corn-gold hair. The Goth. Young Cargill smiled as Mrs. Larder finished her account. "And do you think that the fact that the poor chap was drowned had anything to do with it?" he asked. "Why, you admit yourself that he was known to have been drinking just before he fell out of his boat." "You may say what you like," returned his hostess impressively, "but since we first came to live at Tirnia only 4 people besides poor Roberts have defied the fates, and each of them was drowned within a year. They were all tourists," she added with something suspiciously like satisfaction. "I am not a superstitious man myself," supplemented the mayor, "but you can't get away from the facts, you know, Cargill." Cargill said no more. He perceived that they had lived long enough in retirement in the little Welsh village to have acquired a pride in its legend. The legend and the mountains are the 2 attractions of Tirnia. The official guidebook devotes an equal amount of space to each. It will tell you that the bay across which the quarries, tramp steamers now sail, was once dry land on which stood a village. Deep in the water, the remains of the village can still be seen in clear weather. But whoever dares to look upon them will be drowned within the year. The local publication gives full details of those who have looked and perished. The legend has received an unexpected boom in the drowning of Roberts, which had just occurred. Roberts was a fisherman who had recently come from the south. One calm day in February, he had rowed out into the bay in fulfillment of a drunken boast. He was drowned 3 days before midsummer. After dinner, young Cargill forgot about it. He forgot almost everything except Betty Lardner. But, oddly enough, as he walked back to the hotel, it was just Betty Lardner who made him think again of the legend. He was in love, and being very young wanted to do something insanely heroic. To defy the fates by looking on the sunken village was an obvious outlet for heroism. He must have thought a good deal about it before he fell asleep, for he remembered his resolution on the following morning. After breakfast he sauntered along the brief strip of asphalt which the villagers believed to be a promenade. He was not actually thinking of the legend, to be precise. He was thinking of Betty Lardner. But he was suddenly reminded of it by a boatman pressing him for his custom. "Yes," he said abruptly, "I will hire your boat if you will row me out to the sunken village. I want to look at it." The Welshman eyed him suspiciously, perceived that he was not joking, and shook his head. "Come," persisted Cargill, "I will make it a sovereign if you care to do it." "Thank you, but indeed no, sir," replied the Welshman. "Not if it was 100 sovereigns." "Surely you're not afraid." "It is not fit," retorted the Welshman, turning on his heel. It was probably this opposition that made young Cargill decide that it would be really worthwhile to defy the legend. He did not approach the only other boatman. He considered the question of swimming. The knowledge that the distance there and back was nearly 5 miles did not render the feat impossible, for he was a champion swimmer. But as soon as he thought of a better way, he went back to the hotel and sought out Basset. Basset was a fellow member of the Middle Temple, and contentedly briefless as himself, and Basset possessed a motor-boat. Basset was not exactly keen on the prospect. "Don't you think it's a rather silly thing to do?" he reasoned. "Of course, it's all rot in a way. It must be. But isn't it just as well to treat that sort of thing with respect?" Eventually, he agreed to take the motorboat to within a few hundred yards of the spot. They would tow a dinghy in which young Cargill could finish the journey. It took young Cargill half an hour to find the spot, but he did find it, and he did look upon and actually see all that remained of the sunken village. He felt vaguely ashamed of himself when he returned to dry land. He noticed that several of the villagers gave him unfriendly glances, and he resolved that he would say nothing of the matter to the Lardners. They were having tea on the lawn when he dropped in. He thought that Mrs. Lardner's welcome was a trifle chilly. After tea, Betty executed a quite deliberate maneuver to avoid having him for a partner at tennis. But he ran her to earth later when they were picking up the balls. "How could you?" was all she said. "I didn't know you knew," he stammered weakly. "Of course, everybody knows. It was all over the village before you returned." "Can't you see what that legend meant to us?" she went on. "It was a thing of beauty, and now you've spoiled it. It's like burning down the trees of the fairy glen. You Goth!" "But suppose I'm drowned before the year's out, like Roberts," he suggested jocularly. "Then I will forgive you," she said. And to Cargill, it sounded exactly as if she meant what she said. A few days later, he returned to town. For 6 months, he thought little about the legend. Then he was reminded of it. He had been spending a weekend at Brighton. On the return journey, he had a first-class smoker in the rear of the train to himself. Towards the end of the hour, he dozed and dreamt of the day he had looked on the sunken village. He was awakened when the train made its usual stop on the bridge outside Victoria. It had been a pleasant dream, and he was still trying to preserve the illusion when his eye fell lazily on the window, and he noticed there was a dense fog. "Bit rough on the legend that I happened to be a Londoner," he mused. "It isn't easy to drown a man in town." He stood up with the object of removing his dressing case from the rack. But before he reached it, there was a shriek of a whistle. A violent shock, and he was hurled heavily into the opposite seat. It was not a collision in the newspaper sense of the word. No one was hurt. A local train creeping along at 4 miles an hour had simply missed its signal in the fog and bumped the Brighton train. Young Cargill, in common with most other passengers, put his head out the window. He saw nothing except the parapet of the bridge. "By God," he muttered, "if that other train had been going a little faster." He could just hear the river gurgling beneath him. He had gotten over his fright by the time he reached Victoria. Just a commonplace accident, he assured himself, as he drove in a taxicab to his chambers. That's the worst of it. If I happen to be drowned in an ordinary way, they'll swear it was the legend. I suppose for that reason I'd better not take any risks. Anyhow, I needn't go near the sea until the year's out. The superstitious would doubtlessly affirm that the fates had sent him one warning, and, angered at his refusal to accept it, had determined to drive home the lesson of his own impotence. For when he arrived at his chamber, he found a cablegram from Paris awaiting him. "Hello, this must be Uncle Peter," he exclaimed as he tore open the envelope. "Fear uncle dying. Come at once. Michel." Michel was the elder Cargill's secretary, and young Cargill was the old man's heir. It was not until he was in the boat train that he realized he was about to cross the sea. It was a coincidence, an odd coincidence. When the ship tossed in an unusually rough crossing, he was prepared to admit to himself that it was an uncanny coincidence. He stayed a week in Paris for his uncle's funeral. When he made the return journey, the channel was like the proverbial mill pond. But it was not until the ship had actually put into Dover that he laughed at the failure of the fates to take the opportunity to drown him. He laughed, to be exact, as he was stepping down the gangway. At the end of the gangway, the fold of the rug which he was carrying on his arm caught in the railing. He turned sharply to free it, and stepping back, canoed into an officer of the deck. It threw him off his balance on the edge of the dockside. Even if the official had not grabbed him, it is highly probable that he could have saved himself from falling into the water, because the gangway railing was in easy reach. And if you remember that he was a champion swimmer, you will agree that it is still more probable that he would not have been drowned, even if he had fallen. But the incident made its impression. His thoughts reverted to it constantly during the next few days. Then he told himself that his attendance at the last rites of his uncle had made him morbid, and it was more or less successful in dismissing the affair from his mind. He had many friends in common with the Lardners. Early in February he was invited for a week's hunting to a house at which Betty Lardner was also a guest. She had not forgotten. She did her best to avoid him and succeeded remarkably well, in spite of the fact that their hostess, knowing something of young Cargill's feelings, had made several efforts to throw them together. One day at the end of the hunt he came alongside of her, and they walked their horses home together. When he was sure they were out of earshot, he asked, "You haven't forgiven me yet?" "You know the conditions," she replied banteringly. "You leave me no alternative to suicide," he protested. "That would be cheating," she said. "You must be drowned honestly or it's no good." Then he made a foolish reply. He thought her humor forced, and it annoyed him. Remember that he was exacerbated. He had looked forward to meeting her, and now she was treating him with studied coldness over what still seemed to him a comparatively trifling matter. "I'm afraid," he said, that is hardly likely to occur. The fact of my being a townsman instead of a drunken boatman doesn't give your legend a fair chance." Less than an hour afterwards, he was having his bath before dressing for dinner. The water was deliciously hot, and the room was full of steam. As he lay in the bath, a drowsiness stole over him. Enjoying the keen physical pleasure of it, he thought what a wholly delightful thing was a hot bath after a hard day's hunting. His mind, bordering on sleep, dwelt lazily on hot baths in general. And then, with a startling suddenness, came the thought that, before now, men have been drowned in their baths. With a shock, he realized he had almost fallen asleep. He tried to rouse himself, but a faintness had seized him. That steam, he could not breathe. He was certain he was going to faint. With a desperate effort of will, he hurled himself out of the bath and threw open the window. It must have been the bath episode that first aroused the sensation of positive fear in Cargill, for it was almost a month later when he surprised the secretary of that swimming club, of which he was the main pillar, by his refusal to take part in any events for the coming season. He was beginning to take precautions. Late one night, when taxicabs were scarce, he found that his quickest way to reach home would be by means of one of the tubes. He was in the descending lift when he suddenly remembered that particular tube ran beneath the river. Suppose an accident should occur, a leakage. After all, such a thing was within the bounds of possibility. Instantly there rose before him the vision of a black torrent roaring through the tunnel. Without waiting for the lift to ascend, he rushed to the staircase and, sweating with terror, gained the street and bribed a loafer to find him a cab. He made an effort to take himself seriously in hand after that. More than one acquaintance had lately told him that he was looking nervy. In the last few weeks, his sane and normal self seemed to have shrunken within him, but was still capable of asserting itself under favorable conditions. It would talk out loud to the rest of him as if to a separate individual. "Look here, old man, this superstition nonsense is becoming an obsession to you," it said one fine April morning. "Yes, I mean what I say, an obsession. You must pull yourself together or you'll go stark mad. And then you'll probably go and throw yourself over the embankment. That legend is all bosh. You're in the 20th century, and you're not a drunken fisherman." "Hello, young Cargill." The door burst open, and Stranick, oozing health and sanity, glared at him. "Jove, what a wreck you look," continued Starnack. "You've been frowsting too much. I'm glad I came. The car's outside. We'll run down to Kensington, take a skiff, and pull up to Moseley." The river! Young Cargill felt the blood singing in his ears. "I'm afraid I can't manage it. I've got an appointment this afternoon," he stammered. Starnack perceived he was lying, and wondered. For a few minutes he gossiped while young Cargill was repeating to himself, "You must pull yourself together. It's becoming an obsession. You must pull yourself together." He was vaguely conscious that Starnack was about to depart. Starnack was already in the doorway. His chance of killing the obsession was slipping from him. A special effort. And then, "Stop!" cried Cargill. "I'll come with you, Stranick." Oddly enough, he felt much better when they were actually on the river. He had never been afraid of water as such, and the familiar scenery, together with the wholesome exercise of scrolling, acted as a tonic to his nerves. They pulled above Moseley Lock. When they were returning, Stranick said, "You'll take her through the lock, won't you?" It was a needless remark, and if Stranick had not made it, all might have been well. As a fact, it set Cargill asking himself why he should not take her through the lock. He was admitted to be a much better boatman than Stranick, and everyone knew that it required a certain amount of skill to manage a lock properly. Locks were dangerous if you played the fool. Before now, people have been drowned in locks. The rest was inevitable. He lost his head as the lower gates swung open and broke the rule of the river by pushing out in front of a launch. The launch was already underway, and young Cargill tried to avoid it better, thrust with his boat hook at the side of the lock. The thrust was nervous and ill-calculated, and the next instant the skiff had blundered under the bow of the launch. It happened very quickly. The skiff was forced broadside on against the lock gates, and was splintered like firewood. Cargill fell backwards, struck his head heavily against the gates, and sank. He returned to consciousness in the lock-keeper's lodge. He had been under water a dangerously long time before Stranick, who had suffered no more than a wetting, had found him. It had been touch and go for his life, but artificial respiration had succeeded. He soon went to pieces after that. From one of the windows of his chamber, the river was just visible. One morning, he deliberately pulled the blinds down. The action was important. It signified that he had definitely given up pretending that he had the power of shaking off the obsession. But if he could not shake it off at all, he could at least keep it temporarily at bay. He started a guerrilla campaign against the obsession with the aid of the brandy bottle. He was rarely drunk and as rarely sober. He was sober the day he was compelled to call on an aunt who lived in the still prosperous outskirts of Paddington. It was one of his good days, and in spite of his sobriety, he had himself in very good control when he left his aunt. In his search for a cab, it became necessary for him to cross the canal. On the bridge he paused and, gripping the parapet, made a surprise attack upon his enemy. Some children playing on the towpath helped him considerably. Their delightful sanity in the presence of the water was worth more to him than the brandy. He was positively winning the battle when one of the children fell into the water. For an instant he hesitated. Then, as on the night of the tube episode, panic seized him. The next instant, the man who was probably the best amateur swimmer in England was running with all his might away from the canal. When he reached his chambers, he waited, with the assistance of the brandy, until a man brought him the last edition of the evening paper. A tiny paragraph on the back sheet told him of the tragedy. An hour later, his man found him face downward on the hearthrug, and wrongly attributing his condition wholly to the brandy, put him to bed. He was in bed about 3 weeks. The doctor, who was also a personal friend, was shrewd enough to suspect that the brandy was the effect rather than the cause of the nerve trouble. About the first week in June, Cargill was allowed to get up. "You've got to go away," said the doctor one morning. "You are probably aware that your nerves have gone to pieces. The sea is the place for you." The gasp that followed was scarcely audible, and the doctor missed it. "You went to Trina Wilfa about this time last year," continued the doctor. "Go there again. Go for long walks on the mountains and put up at a temperance hotel." He went to your Wolfa. The train journey of 6 hours knocked him up for another week. By the time he was strong enough for the promenade, it was the 14th of June. He noted the date on the hotel calendar and realized that the fates had another 10 days in which to drown him. He did not call on the Lardners. He felt that he couldn't after the canal episode. 4 of the 10 days had passed before Bethany Lardner ran across him on the promenade. She noticed at once the change in him and was kinder than she had ever been before. "Next Saturday," he said, "is the anniversary." For an answer, she smiled at him, and he might have smiled back if he had not remembered the canal. She met him each morning after that, so that she was with him on the day when he made his atonement. There had been a violent storm in the early morning. It had driven one of the quarry streamers onto the long sandbank that lies submerged between Trina-Wilfa and Puffin Island. The gale still lasted, and the steamer was in momentary danger of becoming a complete wreck. There was no lifeboat service at Trina-Wilfa. It was impossible to launch an ordinary boat in such a sea. Colonel Denbury, the owner of the quarry, and a local magistrate, who had been superintending what feeble efforts had been made to effect a rescue, answered gloomily when Betty Lardner asked him if there was any hope. "It's a terrible thing," he jerked. "First time there's been a wreck hereabouts. It's hopeless trying to find a boat. Suppose a fellow were to swim out to the wreck with a lifeline in tow. It was young Cargill who spoke. The colonel glared at him contemptuously. "He would need to be a pretty fine swimmer," he returned. "I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I am considered to be one of the best amateur swimmers in the country," replied Cargill calmly. "If you will tell your men to get the line ready, I will borrow a bathing suit from somewhere." They both stared at him in amazement. "But you're still an invalid," cried Betty Lardner. "You—" She stopped short and regarded him with fresh wonder. Somehow he no longer looked an invalid. Mechanically she walked by his side to the little bathing office. Suddenly she clutched his arm. "Jack," she said, "have you forgotten the legend?" "Betty," he replied, "have you forgotten the crew?" While he was undressing, the attendant asked him some trivial question. He did not hear the man. His thoughts were far away. He was thinking of a group of children playing on the bank of a canal. To the accompaniment of the colonel's protests, they fixed a belt on him which was attached to the lifeline. He walked along the sloping wooden projection that is used as a landing stage for pleasure skiffs, walked until the water splashed over him, then dived into the boiling surf. Thus it was that he earned Betty Lardner's forgiveness. So quoth this raven. Well, my darlings, I hope that helped you drift off to sleep. Thanks for coming, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, special thanks to Charlotte Emerson and to Cortez Williams.